Let's now start to add in some new tables, columns, or whatever else is required to implement this tagging people functionality. Now, between the last video and this one, I came up with a little idea. So here's my idea for some additional table we could add in to model this idea of tagging a person inside of a photo. We might add a tags table that's going to have a foreign key column that's going to point at a user who was tagged inside of a post, and then the post that they were actually tagged in. So for this first row right here, we would say that user Janny was tagged or essentially mentioned inside of the photo of post ID 3. That would be this one right here. Naturally, one post can mention many different users. So for example, post with ID 3, so there's 1, 2, 3. So post with ID 3 has 3 separate people mentioned in this case. And it looks like the same person was mentioned every time. Totally fine. We don't necessarily have any rule against that. Maybe one person can be mentioned many times inside of the same post. So it definitely looks like this approach would, well, more or less work. There's just one little issue with it. The tags table in this case doesn't actually record where the tag was added in the photo. Remember, a tag is added to a very specific spot in a photo. Maybe the exact center, a little bit off to the right, a little bit towards the top. Wherever it is, we need to store it somewhere, so it has to be inside the database. So we need to come up with some way of encoding where a tag is added in a photo. Here's one way that we might do it. Now this is just one possible way. There's definitely more than one way to handle this. This is just one way that I think we could very easily store inside of our database. So we could record the location of every mention in a photo as some distance measured from the top left of the photo itself. So maybe the top left of the photo is all the way up here. So we could then measure the distance over to the right as some kind of x distance, and then some distance down and record that as some kind of y distance. Now this is kind of assuming that all the different photos we're ever going to work with are more or less identically shaped or have the same dimensions. We're not going to worry about that too much. Maybe photos have different dimensions. Who knows? We're just going to kind of ignore that fact and say that we're going to record the x and y coordinate of any given mention. So if we start to think about that, maybe our table changes a little bit. So now the tags table can have a user ID, a post ID, and then the location in pixels of the mention itself. So x coordinate, y coordinate. Just like we saw with longitude and latitude, there might be some better kind of data type that we could use inside of Postgres. We can investigate that later on down the line. Okay, so this looks like it would work. Absolutely, no problems whatsoever, right? Well, we're definitely have a good design here for this entire kind of tagging feature inside of a photo, but there is one little issue, one very small thing that I think we need to consider before we start to create any table called simply tags. Let me show you what that is. All right, so I've got another screenshot here. It's of a post. We're looking at the caption of the post. So remember, that's all the text inside of it. And I want you to notice something interesting in here. Notice how there are kind of tags or mentions inside of this thing. So this is a mention to some other user, Stephen Wilkes. There's also a tag or a mention down here as well that is mentioning or tagging a user. So we're talking about tags that are being added into a caption and tags that are being added into a photo. Kind of seems like these are very different things, but I just want to kind of explore this avenue really quickly. They are both kind of, if you really consider these things, you might call them both tags. You might call them both the mentions. And because they kind of seem like they're kind of tagging or relating some random user to a post, maybe these are two kinds of resources that need to be modeled together in some way. I just want to kind of explore this a little bit and think about whether or not we need to somehow model these two different tags together at all. And the very first thing I want to mention is that just because there's some highlighted text inside of a caption doesn't necessarily mean that we need to store something inside the database. In other words, if we just take that caption text, which we're definitely already storing inside of our post table, we could just take all that text, send it down to the mobile app, and it could be up to the mobile app to parse this text and say, oh, you know what, this at something right there, that looks like a mention. So I'm going to highlight it in some special way, and if a user taps on this, I'm going to take them to some profile for this user, Stephen Wilkes. So without a doubt, we could implement this entire caption thing right here and the idea of mentions inside of a caption without storing anything inside the database. We could just store this as plain text. That's it. Everything is fine. The real question here is whether or not the mention inside of a caption needs to affect any other part of our app. Let me give you some examples of that. Whenever a user is mentioned inside of a caption, do you want to show a list of posts where a particular user was mentioned? Let's say I want to find every post where Dwayne Johnson, that's another American actor, was mentioned. If that is the case, we need something inside of our database that records which posts Dwayne was mentioned in. Do we want to ever show a list of the most often mentioned users? So maybe there's some users out there who are just really famous and get mentioned all the time, and we want to show a list of which ones get mentioned just all the time. Well, for that, we need to have something inside of our database once again. That implies that when we create this caption, we need to somehow kind of realize that a user is being mentioned in there and validate that mention as being some user and store that as some kind of relation tied to this caption and the user who is mentioned. So we can query it at some future point in time when we want to generate a list like this. And then finally, the most important one, or probably the most relevant one, do we ever need to somehow notify a user that they have been mentioned? If we do, that implies, once again, that we need to somehow parse this entire caption right here, recognize when a user has been mentioned, and then store something inside the database that says, hey, this user has been mentioned, we need to bug them the next time they log in and tell them that they just got mentioned and they should go and check out this post. So again, just because some text is highlighted doesn't mean that we have to store something inside the database. It's a question of whether or not that mention needs to trigger some other kind of behavior, or if we want to somehow produce some metrics or somehow link back to this thing. That is when we need to start to think about storing this mention as some record inside of our database. All right, now to avoid this video getting too long, we're going to pause right here. I think that you can agree with me that these are all features that we probably want to have inside of an Instagram app. If you get mentioned, we want to somehow notify you. We want to tell you the next time you log in that you need to go over and check something out and go check this post out. And if you ever get mentioned, you maybe want to see how often you get mentioned. So I think that these are all features that we'd probably want to have, which implies that we need to somehow store a list of people who get mentioned inside of a particular post. All right, so let's take a pause right here and kind of follow up on this discussion in just a moment.